Cavalier County, Dakota Territory. October 1883, while every homesteader on the northern plains was building fireplaces against their walls with chimneys rising straight up, Jonas Varick was doing something that made his neighbors stop their wagons just to argue with him. The 15-year-old Polish immigrant was digging a pit 3 feet below his cabin floor, building his firebox at the bottom, and running stone channels beneath the entire structure before the chimney ever reached outside air. He's built it upside down. One farmer told another, "The smoke will fill the house and kill them all." Nobody understood what Jonas knew about heat, that it rises, and that floors stay frozen. And if you want to find out what happened when January hit -42 degrees, and his children played barefoot on warm stones, while neighbors huddled over fires that heated nothing but the ceiling, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Jonas Varick had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1881, part of the great wave of Polish immigrants who fled their partitioned homeland, seeking land and freedom in the American West. He'd left behind the Posse region in northeastern Poland, where winters stretched 6 months long and peasant families had refined survival techniques over generations of brutal cold under Russian imperial rule. In Poland, Jonas had worked as a mason's apprentice in Białystok, learning to build the massive tile stoves wealthy families used to heat their manor houses. But he'd also spent winters in village homes where poorer families couldn't afford such luxuries. Homes where clever builders had developed a different approach entirely. They built their fires below floor level, running smoke through stone channels beneath the living space before it ever reached the chimney. The floor became the heating surface, radiating warmth upward into the room where people actually lived. The physics were obvious to anyone who understood heat. Warm air rises. In a conventional fireplace, flames heated the air directly in front of the hearth, and that warm air immediately floated to the ceiling, the least useful place in any room. Families crouched near the flames while their heads baked and their feet froze. The ceiling collected heat that slowly leaked through the roof, while the floor remained cold as the grave. The Polish village solution inverted everything. Put the fire below. Let the heat rise through the floor. Warm the surface where people actually stood, sat, slept, and lived. America promised land and opportunity. What it delivered in the northern reaches of Dakota Territory were winters that made Polish cold seem almost gentle, and an approach to heating that baffled Jonas completely. His first January near the Canadian border nearly killed him. He'd been working as a farmhand on an established homestead, sleeping in a cabin with a conventional stone fireplace that roared all night and still couldn't keep the floor from frosting over. The American farmer burned wood constantly, feeding flames that sent their heat straight to the ceiling while everyone's feet went numb. They slept on raised platforms to escape the frozen floor, waking every few hours to feed the fire, cursing the cold that crept up from below. Jonas watched this with quiet disbelief. The fireplace worked hard. The chimney drew well. The problem wasn't the fire, it was where the heat went afterward, straight up to the ceiling, through the roof, into the Dakota sky. The floor, where the family spent their waking hours, received almost nothing. By 1883, Jonas had saved enough from farm work and odd masonry jobs to claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act, 8 miles south of the Canadian border in Cavalier County. The land was flat, treeless, and exposed to every wind that howled down from Manitoba. Other homesteaders built conventional cabins with conventional fireplaces, fighting the same losing battle against cold that every Dakota settler knew. Jonas would build something different. His nearest neighbor, a Norwegian farmer named Erik Lindgren, watched Jonas survey the property with measuring ropes and stakes marking not just the cabin footprint, but a complex pattern of trenches beneath it. "Planning a root cellar?" Lindgren asked, riding over to introduce himself. "A fireplace," Jonas replied, his English still thick with Polish consonants. "Under the floor, 3 feet down. The smoke travels beneath the cabin before it exits. The floor becomes warm." Lindgren stared for a long moment, then laughed, not cruelly, but genuinely confused. "Friend, smoke rises. Fire goes in a fireplace against the wall. Chimney goes up. That's how it works in America." "Yes," Jonas said calmly. "In Poland, we learn to make heat go where we need it. The argument with his wife Sophia began the moment Jonas showed her where the fireplace would not be. He walked her across the cabin site, pointing to the network of trenches beneath the floor of the fire pit 3 feet below ground level, and the stone channels that would snake across the entire foundation before releasing smoke through a chimney on the far wall. "The fire burns in a hole," Sophia said flatly, staring at the marked ground. "Beneath our feet," Jonas replied. "In a stone chamber, properly vented, the smoke never enters the room." "And if the stones crack, if smoke leaks through the floor," she asked, "we will suffocate. The children will suffocate. The stones will not crack. I will build it properly, the way the old masons built in Podlasie, thick channels, sealed with clay, covered with stone slabs." Sophia had followed her husband across an ocean, across half a continent, into a land so remote the nearest town was 3 hours away by wagon. She had endured the crowded ship, the rattling trains, the isolation of a place where almost no one spoke Polish. But building a fire beneath her children's feet felt like a risk too terrible to accept. "The Americans have fireplaces," she said quietly. "Stone fireplaces against the wall. They work badly," Jonas replied. "They heat the ceiling while the floor freezes. I watched children sleep in coats all winter because the floor was too cold. Our children will play barefoot on warm stone." Word of Jonas's plan reached Eric Lindgren within the week. He rode over under the excuse of discussing property boundaries and found Jonas 3 feet deep in an excavation pit, laying stones for the underground fire chamber. Jonas Lindgren called down, "The men at the general store are talking about your fireplace. Let them talk. They say you're building it backward, underground, running smoke beneath your floor." Lindgren shook his head slowly. "I've farmed this territory 6 years. I've seen clever ideas fail, flooded root cellars, collapsed, sod roofs. New approaches don't survive Dakota winters." "This approach survives centuries in Poland," Jonas replied. "Winter's colder than this. Poland has forests," Lindgren said. "Hills to block the wind. We've got grass, sky, and cold that freezes your blood between barn and house." Lindgren crouched at the edge of the pit. "What happens when soot builds up? When seals fail, and carbon monoxide seeps through your floor while you sleep?" "I clean the channels every autumn. Clay over stone holds for decades. This is proven construction." The confrontation at the general store in Langdon came 2 weeks later. Jonas rode in for supplies, lime flatstones, fire clay, and found a group of homesteaders gathered near the counter. "Pox says he built his fireplace in a hole," one man said, 3 feet underground, smoke running under the floor. "Either crazy or trying to kill his family. Heard he's got 40 feet of smoke channel before the chimney even exits," another added. "That's not a fireplace. That's a way to die in your sleep." Jonas said nothing. He collected his supplies, paid the storekeeper, and drove home through the autumn afternoon. Let them laugh. Come January, they'd huddle around fireplaces that heated their ceilings while their children shivered on frozen floors. His children would play barefoot on warm stone. What Jonas understood from generations of Polish village construction, modern heating engineers would later quantify with precision. The problem with conventional fireplaces was simple. Heat rises. When wood burns in a traditional hearth, flames generate temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That superheated air immediately climbs up the firebox, up the chimney, toward the ceiling. A conventional fireplace radiates perhaps 20% of its heat into the living space. The rest goes straight up and out, warming the sky while families freeze. But the problem went deeper than chimney loss. Even the heat that entered the room behaved badly. Warm air rose to the ceiling, creating a temperature gradient that could span 30 degrees between floor and roof. Families experienced this as hot heads and frozen feet. The ceiling might reach 75 degrees while the floor hovered near freezing. The most useful heating zone from floor to waist height received almost nothing. Jonas's system inverted this dysfunction entirely. By placing the firebox 3 feet below floor level and running smoke through channels beneath the living space, he transformed the floor itself into a massive radiant heating surface. Heat no longer rose uselessly to the ceiling. It entered the room from below, warming the zone where people actually lived. The physics of radiant floor heating were remarkably efficient. Stone and masonry absorbed heat slowly, but released it even more slowly, creating thermal mass that continued radiating warmth long after the fire died. A conventional fireplace demanded constant feeding, let the flames fade, and the room cooled within an hour. Jonas's stone floor, properly heated, continued radiating warmth for 8 to 12 hours after the last log burned. The temperature distribution was equally superior. Radiant heat from below rose naturally through the living space, creating even warmth from floor to ceiling rather than the harsh gradient of conventional heating. More critically, the floor, the surface in constant contact with human feet, became the warmest part of the room instead of the coldest. Jonas's channel design maximized heat extraction before smoke ever exited the cabin. The fire pit sat at the lowest point, 3 feet below the floor. From there, smoke entered a main channel that traveled toward the center of the structure, then split into a serpentine pattern that snaked back and forth beneath the entire floor before finally converging on the exit chimney at the far wall. The total path exceeded 40 feet. 40 feet of contact between hot smoke and stone floor slabs. 40 feet of heat transfer before a single BTU escaped into outside air. The mathematics told the story. Smoke entering the channel system at 600 degrees exited the chimney at perhaps 200. That 400-degree drop represented captured heat, energy that would have vanished up a conventional chimney, now stored in stone and released slowly into the living space above. The key was thermal mass. The stone slabs covering the channels, each 4 inches thick, absorbed heat during the burn and released it gradually over many hours. Combined with the stone channel walls and the packed earth surrounding them, the system created a massive thermal battery beneath the cabin floor. His neighbors saw a fireplace as something you huddled in front of, feeding constantly, fighting to keep alive. Jonas saw a fireplace as energy to be harvested, captured in stone, and released through the coldest nights. Not into the ceiling where it served no one, but into the floor where life actually happened. The excavation began in late May of 1883. As soon as the Dakota ground thawed enough to work, Jonas had spent the winter preparing, collecting flat stones from a creek bed 10 miles away, mixing fire clay with sand, and planning every inch of the channel system that would snake beneath his cabin floor. The project required far more digging than any conventional homestead, but the materials cost almost nothing. The true investment was knowledge and labor. The fire pit came first. Jonas dug a chamber 3 feet deep, 4 feet long, and 3 feet wide, lining it with the thickest stones he'd collected. The walls rose vertically, mortared with clay that would harden under heat. A stone lintel across the top supported the access hatch, a removable slab that allowed him to feed the fire from inside the cabin without smoke entering the living space. The channel system demanded the most care. From the fire pit, Jonas dug a trench 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide, running it in a serpentine pattern across the entire cabin footprint. The path traveled north, turned east, doubled back west, turned again, a continuous snake covering 40 feet before reaching the chimney location on the far wall. He lined each section with flat stones set on edge, creating smooth walls that wouldn't trap soot or obstruct airflow. The channel floors received the flattest stones, carefully fitted to prevent ash buildup. Fire clay sealed every joint, mixed thick, and pressed into each gap. It would cure during the first firings, becoming nearly as hard as stone itself. The channel covers came next. Large flat slabs, some weighing over 100 pounds, were laid across the trenches, forming the base layer of the cabin floor. Jonas fitted them precisely, leaving no gaps for smoke to escape while ensuring each slab could be removed individually for cleaning. The seams received another layer of clay sealant pressed into every crack. By July, the underground system was complete. 40 feet of stone channels beneath a 16 by 20-foot cabin footprint, connecting a sunken fire pit to a chimney rising from the far wall. Jonas lit a small test fire and walked the floor above, pressing his palm against the stones. Within an hour, warmth spread through the slabs, faint but unmistakable. The system drew properly. Heat transferred exactly as planned. The cabin rose through August. Jonas built the walls from pine logs, sealed tight with clay and moss, but the floor received special attention. Above the channel covers, he laid a second layer of flat stones with sand between them, creating a smooth surface that radiated heat evenly. The stones were fitted so tightly a knife blade couldn't slip between them. The chimney rose from the far wall, a full 30 feet from the fire pit, marking the end of the smoke's underground journey. Jonas built it of stone as well, extending 8 feet above the roofline to ensure a proper draft. The draw would need to pull smoke through 40 feet of resistance before reaching open air. On September 15, 1883, Jonas lit the first real fire in the completed system. He fed it steadily for 4 hours, letting flames heat the stone chamber and send hot smoke coursing through channels beneath his feet. By evening, the floor stones were warm to the touch, not hot, but gently warm, radiating upward into the cabin. Zofia removed her shoes and stood barefoot on the stone floor, tears forming in her eyes. "It works," she whispered. "It has always worked," Jonas replied. The Americans simply never learned. By late October, Jonas's cabin had become the most discussed structure in Cavalier County. Homesteaders detoured on their way to Langdon just to stare at the building with the chimney on the wrong wall. Cowboys gathered at the saloon to debate whether the Polish family would suffocate, freeze, or somehow burn down a cabin with no visible fireplace inside. The reactions shifted from amusement to genuine alarm. "It's not natural," one homesteader declared at the general store, warming his hands near the pot-bellied stove. "A fireplace belongs against a wall where you can see it. His family can't even sit by their fire. It's buried underground." Another agreed. "Ruined smoke under a floor for 40 feet, and something will crack. They'll be dead by Christmas." "Maybe he doesn't know better," someone muttered. "Someone ought to warn that wife of his." Eric Lindgren inspected the completed cabin in early October, walking slowly through the single room as Jonas explained the system. The Norwegian pressed his palm against the floor stones, feeling the faint warmth lingering from the morning fire, and shook his head in disbelief. "It's warm," Lindgren admitted. "I'll grant you that, but it's barely cold yet. Wait until January. Wait until it's 40 below and you need real heat, not warm stones." "The stones hold more heat than air ever could," Jonas replied. "When January comes, I burn longer fires. The floor stores the warmth and releases it all night." "And when those channels fill with soot?" Lindgren asked. "When the clay seals crack from freezing and thawing, the channels are sized for cleaning. I built access points at each turn. The clay is mixed with sand for flexibility. This system has worked for centuries in Poland." "This isn't Poland," Lindgren said, mounting his horse. "I hope you're right, Jonas. I genuinely do. But I've seen this territory humble men with better ideas than underground smoke." Zofia faced her own pressures. The few women in the area had little contact with the Polish wife, but those who did expressed concern in careful terms. A farmeress wife named Ingrid Hogan stopped by in late October with a basket of preserved vegetables. A neighborly gesture that came with pointed questions. "Your cabin has no fireplace," Ingrid said, glancing around the interior. "No hearth. Where do you gather in the evening? How do you cook?" "We cook on a small iron stove for summer work," Zofia replied. "In winter, I cook over the fire pit. There is a grate above the flames." She gestured to the access hatch in the floor. "The fire is there." "Beneath us in the floor?" Ingrid asked, touching the stone with her boot, feeling the faint warmth. "It's unusual. In Poland, the old homes all heated this way," Zofia said. "The floor is warm. The children can play anywhere in the room, not just near the fire." The first hard frost came on November 6th. Jonas lit a larger fire than usual in the underground pit, feeding it steadily for 6 hours before letting it die to coals. He and Zofia retired for the night as temperatures dropped to 18 degrees outside. The floor radiated gentle, even warmth throughout the night. The thermometer by the door read 58 degrees at midnight, 52 at dawn. No fire had burned for 8 hours. The thermal mass of heated stone sealed beneath the living space held its warmth while the Dakota wind howled outside. Zofia awoke to find her children sitting on the warm floor, playing with wooden toys in their nightclothes. She had never seen them do that in winter. January 1884 arrived with a brutality even the old-timers struggled to recall. An Arctic front descended from Manitoba on January 11th, driving temperatures from a mild 15 degrees to -22 by midnight. By dawn on January 12th, the mercury had plunged to -30 ppi, and on the morning of January 13th, the thermometer outside Eric Lindgren's farmhouse read -42, the coldest temperature recorded in Cavalier County since settlement began. The wind made it worse. Gusts of 30 miles per hour drove wind chills to numbers that defied survival. Exposed flesh froze in under a minute. Livestock that couldn't reach shelter died where they stood. Snow didn't fall so much as a tack, driving horizontally across the open prairie with nothing to stop it from the Canadian north. Across the county, the desperate battle for survival began. Eric Lindgren burned through his carefully stacked woodpile at an alarming rate. His stone fireplace roared day and night, flames leaping 3 feet high. Yet frost formed on the cabin floor 10 feet from the hearth. His children slept in piles of blankets on raised platforms, their breath visible, their feet too frozen to touch the ground. He woke every 90 minutes to feed the flames, stumbling through darkness that pressed in from every direction. The Hogan family, 3 miles west, fared worse. Their chimney cracked on the second night. The temperature difference between the roaring fire inside and the killing cold outside split the mortar between stones. They stuffed rags into the gap, burned twice the wood for half the heat, and abandoned the main room entirely, huddling near the failing fireplace. A bachelor homesteader named William Garrett ran out of firewood on January 14th. He burned his furniture, then his floorboards, cutting away the very boards he stood on to feed the flames. When neighbors found him 2 days later, he was alive but delirious, crouched in a corner of a cabin with no floor, surrounded by frozen earth. At the Jonas homestead, January 11th began like any other winter day. Jonas rose before dawn, lifted the access hatch in the floor, and descended into the fire pit to light the morning blaze. He fed it steadily for 4 hours, dry oak and ash, burning hot and clean, as smoke traveled its 40-foot journey beneath the cabin before exiting the distant chimney. By the time temperatures plunged to -42, the stone floor had absorbed enough heat to radiate warmth for the next 12 hours. Jonas and Zofia spent the worst of the cold snap inside, venturing out only to tend livestock and gather fuel. Their children, 5-year-old Marta and 3-year-old John, played on the floor in stocking feet, the warm stones comfortable against their skin. They built towers from wooden blocks. They napped on blankets spread directly on the heated surface. They never once shivered. The thermometer by the door read 55 degrees on the coldest morning, while outside air froze exposed flesh in seconds. The floor surface measured 72 degrees, warmer than the air above it, radiating gentle heat upward into the living space. On January 15th, Eric Lindgren sent a farmhand to check on the Polish family. The man rode through brutal cold, expecting frozen bodies or desperate misery. Instead, he found Jonas calmly splitting wood outside the cabin, his children visible through the frost-covered window, playing barefoot on the floor. The farmhand returned with news that sounded impossible. The family with the backward fireplace was warmer than anyone else in the territory. Eric Lindgren arrived at the Jonas homestead on January 17th, 2 days later. He had barely slept in a week. Constant fire feeding. Frozen floors. Children waking crying from cold. His face was raw, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He found Jonas outside, stacking firewood at a leisurely pace. The woodpile looked barely touched, despite a week of the worst cold in memory. "Show me," Lindgren said. "Show me how you're still alive." Jonas led him inside. Lindgren stopped 3 steps through the door. The air was warm, genuinely, comfortably warm, with no roaring fire in sight, no flames, no glowing stove, just 4 log walls, and a stone floor radiating heat like a living thing. "Touch the floor," Jonas said. Lindgren crouched and pressed his palm against the smooth stone. Warmth met his frozen skin, not hot, but deeply, unmistakably warm. He moved his hand across the surface. The temperature was even everywhere. "It's warm," he whispered. "The whole floor is warm. 72 degrees at the surface," Jonas said. "The air is 55. Heat rises from below." The children played barefoot in the corner. Lindgren stared at them as if they were apparitions. "My children sleep in 3 layers of wool," he said quietly. "They haven't taken their boots off in a week." Jonas retrieved a notebook from a shelf and opened it. He had recorded everything: exterior temperatures, floor readings, air levels, burn times. January 13th, Jonas read, outside temperature -42, floor surface 71, air at floor level 54, ceiling 51, fire pit burn, time 4 hours morning, 3 hours evening. Total would consume 60 pounds. Lindgren took the notebook, flipping through page after page of careful measurements. The numbers inverted everything Lindgren thought he knew about heating. Floor temperatures warmer than air temperatures, ceilings cooler than floors. Consistent warmth throughout the room instead of scorching heat near the fire, and freezing cold everywhere else. 60 pounds, Lindgren repeated quietly. We burned 400 per day, almost 7 times as much. Your fire heats the air, Jonas said. The air rises to the ceiling, leaks through the roof, and disappears forever. You must keep burning to replace what is lost. He gestured at the floor beneath their feet. My fire heats the stones. The stones hold the heat. The heat rises slowly, warming the room from below. I burn once in the morning, once in the evening. The floor stays warm all night. Lindgren walked the cabin slowly, pressing his hand against the floor at intervals. The warmth was remarkably consistent, the same gentle heat whether he stood near the fire pit hatch or in the far corner by the chimney. Pachanos, he said slowly. How do you know they won't fill with soot and block? I build cleaning hatches at each turn, Jonas replied. Every autumn, I clear the passages with brushes and rods. The system is designed for maintenance. Lindgren closed the notebook and handed it back. He looked around the cabin again, the children playing barefoot, the mother working at the table in comfortable clothing, the gentle warmth rising from below. I called you crazy, he said finally. Told everyone you were building a death trap. You didn't understand, Jonas said. How could you? You had never felt heat from below. The first visitor after Eric Lindgren was a farmer whose children had removed their boots. In a week, a man named Olaf Bergstrom. He arrived on January 19th with desperation in his eyes and frostbite blackening 2 of his fingers. Lindgren told me about your floor, Bergstrom said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Your children play barefoot while mine sleep in wool coats. I need to see it. I need to understand. Jonas welcomed him without hesitation. Bergstrom spent an hour in the warm cabin, crouching to touch the heated stones, watching the children play in their stocking feet, pressing his damaged hands against the warm floor surface as if it could heal what the cold had taken. It's like summer in here, Bergstrom whispered. The heat comes from everywhere, from below. It rises into everything. The furniture, the walls, the people. No cold spots, no frozen floors. By the end of January, Jonas had hosted 14 families in his cabin. Some sought refuge from failing fireplaces. Others simply needed to experience the impossible for themselves. Homesteaders who had laughed at the backward fireplace now sat on his warm floor with their boots removed for the first time in weeks, asking questions about stone channels, fire pit depths, and clay sealant mixtures. Eric Lindgren was the first to commit to building his own system. He arrived in early February with his 2 eldest sons, notebooks ready, prepared to learn everything Jonas could teach. The excavation comes first, Jonas explained, walking them through the construction sequence on paper. 3 feet deep for the fire pit, 8 inches deep for the channels. The pattern must cover the entire floor. No shortcuts, no dead spots. He spent 4 days teaching stone selection, channel construction, and proper clay mixing ratios. He showed them how to lay flat stones for smooth smoke flow, how to seal joints without blocking the passage, how to build access hatches for annual cleaning. You're giving away everything, Zofia observed, one evening after yet another group departed with pages of diagrams and instructions. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge lost, Jonas replied. In Poland, every village knew how to build heated floors. Here, I am the only one. If I keep the secret, it dies with me. If I share it, it lives forever. The first new construction began at the Lindgren farm in April. Jonas supervised personally, checking every channel depth, testing every stone placement, ensuring the system would draw properly. The Norwegian and his sons did the labor while the Polish immigrant guided every decision. By June, 3 more systems were under construction across the county. A German immigrant named Friedrich Weber adapted the design for a larger cabin, running 60 feet of channels beneath a 20-by-20-4 floor. A widow named Margaret Olson hired hands to retrofit her existing cabin, lifting floorboards and excavating channels beneath a home that had nearly killed her family the previous winter. The Langdon newspaper ran a story in August about the Polish method of radiant floor heating. Letters arrived from across Dakota Territory, from Minnesota and Montana, from settlers desperate for any alternative to fireplaces that heated ceilings while floors froze. Jonas answered every letter. He drew diagrams, explained principles, and described the construction sequence in careful detail. He charged nothing, refused payment even when it was pressed upon him. In Poland, this knowledge belonged to everyone who needed it, he told Lindgren. It should belong to everyone here as well. Cold does not choose its victims by nationality. Neither should warmth. The man who built his fireplace backward became the most important teacher in Cavalier County. Jonas lived another 41 years on that Dakota homestead. He died in 1924, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up playing barefoot on warm stone floors while blizzards raged outside. The original cabin stood until 1952, when his grandson dismantled it to build a modern house with a basement furnace. The underground channels were still intact after nearly 70 years, no cracks, no collapses. The same system that had carried the family through the brutal winter of 1884, still functioning perfectly. The winter of 1884 became the benchmark against which all Dakota winters were measured. Old-timers would ask one another, is it as bad as '84? The answer was almost never yes. But lesser winters still killed livestock and exhausted families who fought the cold with conventional fireplaces that heated ceilings while floors froze. Every frozen morning reminded them of what Jonas had proven possible. By 1895, radiant floor heating systems had spread beyond Cavalier County into neighboring Pembina Walsh and Towner counties. Agricultural journals began publishing articles about the Polish method of underfloor heating. In 1901, the North Dakota Agricultural Extension invited Jonas to speak at their annual meeting. The immigrant, once mocked for building his fireplace backwards, now stood before an audience of over 300 farmersmen desperate for knowledge that could mean the difference between surviving winter or losing everything. Heat rises, Jonas told them, his Polish accent still thick after decades. This is physics. No man can change it. The only question is where you allow it to rise from. He paused. A fireplace against the wall sends heat to the ceiling where no one lives. A fire beneath the floor lets heat rise through the room itself. Same fire, same fuel. Very different results. Eric Lindgren never returned to conventional heating. His farm became a living demonstration of the radiant system. Every building eventually converted to underfloor channels. His sons built their own homesteads the same way, starting with warmth beneath their feet. The Lindgren family remained in Cavalier County for 4 generations. Each generation walked on warm floors, while their neighbors still huddled around fireplaces, watching heat vanish into the ceiling. What Jonas understood then appears today in modern radiant floor heating across the world. Hydronic systems push heated water through tubes beneath floors. Electric systems warm cables buried in concrete. The materials have changed, the mathematics refined, but the insight remains untouched. Heat the floor and the room takes care of itself. Jonas had learned what generations of Polish village builders already knew. Fighting physics wastes energy. Working with it multiplies results. While others burned more wood trying to replace lost heat, Jonas stored warmth beneath his feet and let it rise slowly into the space where life actually happened. And that lesson reaches far beyond heating. Every problem offers to paths brute force solutions that exhaust those who choose them, and elegant solutions that work with natural forces instead of against them. Jonas's neighbors saw rising heat as a problem. Jonas saw it as a delivery system. Zofia outlived Jonas by 6 years. She spent her final winters walking across the same warm stone floors they had built together, the floors where her children played barefoot and her grandchildren learned to crawl. After her death, their daughter found a note tucked inside the family Bible. Written in Zofia's careful Polish script, he said the fire belonged beneath our feet. I said he was building a tomb. He built us the warmest home in Dakota Territory, and our children never knew frozen floors. Jonas understood something the Americans never learned. Heat wants to rise. The question is, do you let it escape, or do you guide it? And if a single idea could change how an entire county survived winter, what other forgotten knowledge is still waiting to be rediscovered? Subscribe, because the next story reveals another idea the world laughed at, until it worked.